Hello everyone. I'm going to try and record 2 talks today, but the first one is short, but it's stimulated by my grandson, who has recently presented us with an early great-grandchild, of which we have several now. And he sent me notes saying, reading to children, I realise I need some guidance. And of course he does. The way children's minds are formed, story plays a major role. Whether they recognise it as a story or not is beside the point. But you know perfectly well that all children love stories. Actually, adults do as well, but children in a very particular way. I have immediately in my mind an image of my wife sitting with a bunch of grandchildren cuddled around her on the couch, and she simply read to them for well over a couple of hours. And they will stop everything else, watching television, whatever it is, for a story read by somebody they know and love who loves them. There's something very special about this. And of course, I'm always saying to preachers, well, look, why don't you follow the master a bit more? Jesus always began, or near the beginning, he had an illustration or an amazing metaphor or something like that. He told stories. And no other person in the history of the world has got into people's minds in the way that Jesus did. Any serious Christian after a year or two could sit down with, say, a couple of other Christians, and they would have little difficulty in writing down at least 90% of the parables and miracles that Jesus performed. They stick in our memory in an amazing way. It's the thing I always struggle with, what makes things memorable. I know that narrative is very definitely part of it, but children in particular is important. One of my favourite writers, Roger Scruton, I just saw a quotation from him today as I was turning over some bits of paper in which I'd scribbled. Scruton had a very high sense of the world we live in. We don't know as much about it as we used to. What did he mean? Well, if you lived in the Middle Ages, a church could have 1,000 members, and the pastor or priest, whatever you call him, would be able to know most of their names, but not directly, indirectly. Our family names show it. Johnson, Baker, they're all names which are tags, if you like, to the narrative of those people. It was the son of John. It was the local baker. In Wales, they still talk about Dye the bread. You know, that is a long, long history. So it wasn't so much that people knew everyone else, but they had connections to everyone else, and they were reliable connections. And in our modern world, the elite who don't even know the meaning of the word home are trying to remove the idea of home and normality and givens in life and create total chaos. I'll be saying more about that in the next talk today, but this one is specifically about children and stories. The stories they are exposed to are critically important. That's why you need to know what they're being exposed to at school. I saw a note in the response to a YouTube, and a guy said, well, my children, who happen to be a white minority in their class, are being told they are guilty of taking away from black children all the things they should have. You shouldn't do that to children. They're certainly not guilty of any such thing. The narrative that they are being exposed to is destroying their sense of safety and security. Children's lives initially should be entirely about being in safe environments, not in the sense of physical safety, but in the sense of cultural safety. So the stories need to be thought about deeply. And the narratives that they're being given in school, I mean, again, I'll say a bit more in the second talk, but drag queen time in school is an undermining of traditional narratives. It's amazing, the same people who refuse to define a woman in one setting demand that she has equal pay in another and don't even see the contradiction. The world that children live in is much more insecure than it used to be. And stories need to deal with that. And the way they do it is by creating a structure of givens in our life. Where there are many givens, in other words, many things are predictable, we are secure. And then we start putting our energy into creative things. But so many people now, particularly kids, young people in school, are so anxious. They're not doing anything other than fussing. They're not building their creative talents. They haven't even discovered them in many cases because school is not doing that. Now, stories do that for children. The stories that a child inhabits, is the way I put it, the stories they live in, will say a lot about what sort of person they're going to be in the long run. Now, if you grow up, there are only half a dozen really big books in the world that create cultures. The biggest one of all is paganism, and that has multiple stories that fit very well for living, say, in a tropical rainforest or in Africa anywhere pretty well at the moment, where very few things are predictable. So the fatalism of paganism, where the world is explained in terms of evil spirits, works if half your children die before maturity and your crops fail at random and your government's terrible. Fatalism makes some kind of sense. You shrug and move on. So when a child dies in Africa, they howl. But by the end of the day, the child will be buried and they'll be carrying on. That's not the way that we function anymore. Their story works for their environment. As Chesterton said, it's the biggest story of all. Then the other stories break down East and West. The West are the Judeo-Christian stories, Judaism, Christianity and Islam. And in the East, Hinduism, Buddhism and their offshoots. Now, the difference between those two sorts of stories is that in the West, moral consequence is built in, and the world can be comprehended as created up until relatively recently. In the East, being smart, I mean, the Hinduism is probably the oldest organized culture in the world. They asked the big questions: where did I come from? Why am I here? Where am I going? And decided that what they knew best was themselves. So Eastern stories go inwards, and they're fantastical, and they're about reincarnation. And the current world being basically not of any great importance in some senses, particularly in Buddhism. The idea is to get beyond it. The narratives coming out of these backgrounds show that. Now, in our world, up until certainly my time in school, the Judeo-Christian story was dominant in the stories read to children. The morals of the animal stories, Peter Rabbit and the like, are Christian morals. Peter gets into trouble because he's been trying to steal Mr. McGregor's vegetables, and his mother is not pleased with his behaviour. The background to the story is a received idea of what good and evil are. The whole point about the modern world, the elite who rule us, is that they want to do away with that solid world and replace it with one where everything is up for grabs. They're obsessed with freedom, but they have defined freedom in the wrong way, and the stories do the same thing. So you've got to look at your children's stories and see what they are about. It's interesting that, what's the name, the author of the Potter stories, she's taking this on big time in the public square, and good for her, talking about these things. Stories matter. But for you with your children, the fundamental first story should be the Bible stories, because that's where our culture comes from. But then all the others flow out of that, the great books. The reason they don't want to teach the old books, Shakespeare and right up until really the middle of the 20th century, is because they all had this backdrop of a creator, a fall, a judgment, and the features of any creedal statement. So children, you don't have to tell them what the stories mean. The stories have moral consequence built into them. They know what's going to happen after a while. You are forming their character by what you read to them. Of course, now that many of their parents don't read either, in fact, many of the young people coming to university now, I say that they've not even been taught how to read. They read the words. No, they don't. They look at the letters. They're typists. They work with letters. Our generation, before computers came along, we worked with words. And even I still like to write things out. And you can look at a sentence on a page and say, that's not as beautiful as it could be. And you stop for a minute and you perhaps reverse a few things and you come up with a sentence that makes much more sense. It has pattern to it. And kids love that sort of things. They will even learn nonsense poems. And they have no meaning. They're just playing with words. The hunting of the snark enters. What is it? The snark was a juju, you see, or something like that. And they can really enjoy those things, and they'll bring them all out in the right order. They're not obsessed with meaning, not any deep meaning. You don't even need to say that. But bits of the story will stick, and they can become part of a family. Now, in our family, there's no question that the books from childhood that we all still refer to are the Narnia stories. In our family, there are phrases that come out of those stories in life. So when things get difficult, in Africa, for instance, Mrs. Beaver's response to the little girl's question about whether Aslan is safe. And she says, oh, no, he's not safe, but he is good. You can trust him, but it's going to be a wild ride. And so a single phrase can bring that whole idea into your mind. Tolkien does the same thing. So with real readers who have loved that book, you can have an interesting conversation simply by asking the question, which bit of the story do you enjoy most? If you pick up The Lord of the Rings and you just want to read for 20 minutes, which bit do you read? And why? Peter Kraft, I think, has written a whole book on this phenomenon. Talking to me, he said, well, the bit he liked best was where Sam and Frodo are struggling through Mordor to take the ring to the fire. And it's really hard going. And then Sam looks up and for a moment the clouds go back and he sees a star twinkling up there. And he thinks to himself, they can see that star in the Shire too. And he's comforted by that relationship, that realization that beyond the immediate troubles, there's still those certainties out there. It's an interesting favourite spot. Mine is undoubtedly where, after the long chase across the plains towards Rohan to try and get back the two hobbits that have been captured by the enemy, but they don't catch up with them. They have another part in the story, and they've come all the way across the plains, and they're resting in the grass. They know that they're probably still alive, but they have to decide what to do. And then up rides Aoma with a squad of horsemen, and they surround these three in the grass, Aragorn, Gimli, and Legolas, and a conversation ensues in which Aoma shows himself to be a great man, because he's supposed to take any intruders within Rohan back to the capital, to the king. Aragorn tells him what's happening and where he's at, and he says, we will not go with you. Then he says, good and evil are not one thing amongst men and another among dwarves and elves, and it is a man's part to discern them. And Aoma discerns correctly and says, I'll let you go, even though he's going to have difficulties when he gets back. Right there in the middle of the story, I think it's it's my favourite story from within The Lord of the Rings. That's how these things work. And in the Bible, of course, the way it's worked, the reading of the Bible regularly and steadily forms a child's mind in marvellous ways. I am deeply grateful for the fact that my mother, realising she had an unusual boy, she taught Sunday school, and they were all the children had a verse to learn every week. But she expected me to learn a chunk, a paragraph, the first 18 verses of John's Gospel or something like that, because she knew I could. And what a gift that is to have that stuff stowed away in your mind. And it's amazing how it can be recalled when you need it. It happens to me quite often. That's what you're thinking about when you think about books for children. You've got to ask yourself, what is this story going to do to them? Is it true in the metaphysical sense, the big sense? Is it teaching them about the world as it actually is? I mean, the biggest mistake we've made in our world at the moment, in my view, is to deny the fall. We are fallen creatures. If you start off with anything other than that as the starting point, you end up with utopian visions that always turn into violence. Ask Eastern Europe and Russia. That's what happened. And it could happen to us. There are certainly people on our side of the fence, so to speak, who would like to have total control. You see that in the bureaucratic mind all the while, and it has to be resisted. The stories matter, and the stories that you inhabit give you the courage to move in the right direction. What story illustrates my current position is the question you ask, and very often people are left in the Bible in difficult spots, and they're not going to understand the outcome for a long while. Here we have no permanent place. Tom Sowell has taken this on board very rapidly, and he says the bottom line about public politics in our world is it must start with the fact that we're flawed. So everything, the best you can do is a trade-off for something a bit better than what we've had before. One of the ways you can set about doing this didactically is playing games which involve reading stories to children from the Bible and finding a phrase that you know has made it into common speech, and then teasing them by using the phrase and asking what it means. My standard example, I have several, but the one that comes to mind at the moment, because it was young people, is saying to medical students, you're going to be taught medicine using the biopsychosocial model of medicine. As far as I'm concerned, that model has been weighed in the balances and found wanting. And my guess is that no more than one of you know what I've just said, because that's a biblical phrase. And if you don't recognize where it comes from, you miss the point. They thought that I was saying the biopsychosocial model was inadequate. It is. But I was also saying more than that, because the phrase comes from Belshazzar's feast, where Belshazzar had profaned the sacred vessels of the Jews for an orgy, and in the middle of that orgy, a hand writes on the wall. Another phrase that turns up in our common speech, or certainly literature. And it writes, many, many tekel upharsin. Of course, Belshazzar and his nobles have no idea what it means, so they send for Daniel, who comes and says, be it known unto you, O King Belshazzar, that the words mean that you have been weighed in the balances and found wanting, and you will be dead, and your kingdom will be gone in the morning. And it happened. We know the date. When I use that phrase with medical students, I don't mean the biopsychosocial model is a few grams underweight, which is the nearest they can get to the truth. I mean that it is profanely and profoundly inadequate because it denies that human beings have a spiritual dimension. And how you can practice medicine without that? Well, you can't. You're doing technical medicine only. Much more is happening when you read stories to your children, and that's why it matters that you look at them and think, what are they learning from this? Yes, you can have bits of nonsense verse, that's fine, they love that. Whether you go to the older ones or whether you use some of the American modern ones, doesn't matter. But they need a basis of stories that they love that actually are true in the deepest possible sense. Obviously, the Bible is the ultimate example, but you can hold up a story and say, can I think of any passages of Scripture that make this story untrue? And if so, you've got to deal with that. I hope that stimulates you to think more about children's books and what they do to a child's mind. And I was delighted on one occasion to find a group of mothers who decided their local school was out of control, and they used their political rights to always have one mother in the schoolroom frequently. They would share it out, but they had a right to go and sit in and listen to what the teachers are saying. And of course, that was a break on the teachers doing some of the things they're doing now, which I'll talk about in the next talk.